democratic South.
On Sunday, June 25th, Communist forces attacked the Republic of Korea. Free nations must be on their guard, more than ever before, against this kind of sneak attack.
Our story begins in Korea, land of the morning calm. Since 1905, Korea had been part of the Japanese Empire. In 1945, during World War II, the Allies took Korea. The Americans and the Soviets split Korea in half along the 38th parallel. The Soviets occupied the north, while the Americans occupied the south.
25th of June, 1950, Civil War began as North Korea crossed the 38th parallel, the border between North and South Korea. On the same day, the UN drafted the UNSC Resolutions 82 calling for 1. All hostilities to end and North Korea to withdraw back to the 38th parallel. 2. A UN Commission on Korea to be formed to monitor the situation and report to the Security Council. And 3. All UN members to support the United Nations in achieving this and refrain from providing assistance to the North Korean authorities. However, North Korea continued their attacks and drove right to Seoul, Seoul being the capital of South Korea. Seoul fell in under a week.
For the Americans, who weren't big fans of communism, there could only be one answer.
Of course, this means war.
The Korean War consisted of two sides. The first side being North Korea, China, and the Soviet Union. The second side being the United Nations.
Justice friends, assemble! Justice friends, assemble!
South Korean, United States, United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. Canadian.
Canada sent over 8 destroyers to serve during the Korean War, mostly to destroy enemy trains and railways. The Crusader alone hit 3 trains. The Canadian Air Force transported 13,000 passengers and 3 million kilograms of cargo. Its fighter pilots took out 20 enemy jets, as well as many trains and trucks.
After North Korea took Seoul, they didn't stop. They pushed South Korea and the UN all the way back to the Pusan perimeter.
This one.
The Battle of Pusan Perimeter was a huge battle between the UN and North Korea. The UN had been cornered and were forced to make a final stand against the invading North Koreans. The UN, having been continuously defeated, were forced back to the Pusan Perimeter, a 230-kilometer defensive line around a small area at the southernmost tip of Korea. This area included the port of Pusan. UN forces fought off North Korean advances for 6 whole weeks. The massive North Korean assaults failed and the UN held the perimeter. But North Korea was persistent in their attacks. And as North Korea's forces were crippled by supply shortages and casualties, the UN used the port to gain troops and supplies. After the 6 weeks, North Korea fell back as the UN launched a counterattack at Incheon in mid-September. This was as far as North Korea would advance throughout the war. Killer was the second counteroffensive by the UN forces against China and North Korea. The offensive lasted 2 weeks, starting on the 20th of February, 1951, and ending the 6th of March. This operation was formulated by General Matthew Ridgway, and was an attempt at pushing the enemy forces back behind the Arizona line. The 2nd Division sprang into action on the 22nd of February. They faced moderate resistance on the 23rd, but the enemy forces, of approximately 2,000, were rolled over and fell back to the north. leaving the dead and wounded behind in the panic of defeat. Further north, the 17th and 18th CCF divisions slowly pushed the enemy north. This operation was a success for the UN and South Korea. North Korea and China faced mass casualties, an estimated over 7,000, which was exactly the desired effect of this operation, to destroy as many personnel, enemy personnel that is, with minimal casualties.
The Yukon landings were a risky operation devised by American General Douglas MacArthur. The plan was to take Yukon, the closest port to Seoul, Korea's capital. It was risky not only because Yukon was deep in enemy territory, but also because of the difference between high tide and low tide. In Korea, there was the biggest difference in the world, which would make it tricky to land. Targets were bombarded 5 days ahead of time on September 15, 1950. The American Army began landing on the beaches in enemy territory. North Koreans were surprised by the attack and overwhelmed. There were 300 casualties on their side, while the Americans were only injured. One of the Korean War's riskiest operations was a complete success. The Americans continued towards Seoul. Hill 55 was a defensive position on the front of the Korean War close to the 38th parallel. Every Canadian battalion would serve there at least once during the Korean War. While Hill 55 was used as a base while doing raids, gathering information, and capturing enemy soldiers, there was also some impressive battles. On November 22, 1951, the Americans were defending Hill 55 and the Canadians were nearby when the Chinese attacked. The Chinese took the hill, but the Canadians held out until the Americans could take the hill back. On October 23rd, the Canadians were attacked by the Chinese. The position had been weakened by earlier bombardments, and many Canadians had to draw back. It looked like the Canadians had lost.
This is the end, beautiful friend.
But then, they returned fire and captured Darius and won back the hill in a day. But Canada's greatest battle was yet to come.
Ladies and gentlemen, a wrestling contest for the world's heavyweight championship. Introducing the world's heavyweight champion, the
Chinese.
and the challenger.
The United Nations 27th Commonwealth Brigade. The United Nations forces were about 2,000 troops strong. China's army was about 10,000 soldiers strong. The battle took place in the Kapyong Valley. On Hill 504 there were the Australians. On Hill 677 there were the Canadians. South of them were the British and New Zealand Middlesex Regiment and headquarters.
Ladies and gentlemen, a special announcement.
The Chinese attacked and the Koreans retreated. The Chinese then continued to invade the valley of Kapyong. The Chinese attacked the Australians first on Hill 504. In the dark, the Australians couldn't tell the difference between the retreating South Koreans and the invading Chinese. New Zealand gunners helped the Australians, but the Chinese still managed to get past them. The Australians were eventually forced to withdraw. Up until this point, the Canadians hadn't seen any heavy fighting. But with the Australians withdrawing, the Chinese now turned their attention to Hill 677. Except they didn't count on one thing. The Chinese tried to attack the Canadian headquarters on Hill 677, but were driven back by machine gun fire. The Chinese blocked a road so that the Canadians would be unable to get any more supplies. But American planes later dropped supplies on the Canadian hill. The Chinese tried attacking the Canadians from the northwestern side of Hill 677. But the Canadians managed to hold their ground. They faced about 5,000 Chinese troops. American reinforcements came, and together they forced the Chinese to withdraw. The Americans later retook Hill 504. 32 Canadians lost their lives during this battle, along with 23 Australians and 3 Americans. These were relatively small numbers, however, compared to the nearly 1,000 Chinese that died. The battle was clearly a UN victory. Against the odds, they managed to protect the valley, which, if it had been taken, may have led to the Chinese recapturing Seoul. The Canadian 2nd Princess Patricia's Light Infantry received a presidential citation for their courage in this battle. They are the only Canadian unit to have ever received this award. Though the UN had scored a victory, it was becoming clear to the Americans that their odds of winning the war were not good with the Chinese involved. The Pejoman peace negotiations began in July 1951. Despite this, the fighting continued, as each side tried to gain more territory. The ceasefire took place in 1953. There was no clear victor in this war, and the new borders were almost exactly the same place they'd been before. No actual peace agreement was reached, so technically North Korea and South Korea are still at war. More than 1,000 people have lost their lives in border fights between them. The countries are supervised by a neutral committee. Of the 26,000 Canadians sent into the Korean War, 516 lost their lives. The Americans lost almost 40,000, and there was even more massive bloodshed among the enemy and civilians. Overall, Korea was a very bloody war, but is also called the Forgotten War. It is not nearly as mentioned as other wars in Canada's history. Canadians fought bravely during this war and deserve to be remembered.
오빤 강남스타일 강남스타일